The answers to your questions are all anonymous. We do not know who's responding, who's actually putting all these ideas in. So we thank you for your willingness to let us know what you hope to achieve today. What are your goals? And listening and learning is probably our #1 priority. We're hoping that that does happen. Very nice. Thank you, everybody, for writing your goals for today. Okay. Still adding some new names, but I'm going to stop. I'm going to exit out of this for a while. We will share with you the ideas that you've brought in after the meeting and see how we've achieved our goals. It's still rolling on. It's still rolling, so it's very nice to see this. Okay.
Am I the only one who's seeing it all blurry?
No, yeah, it's Marisa. I was going to say the same thing. I'm not seeing it clearly on my screen.
Yeah, I was. And now not.
Okay.
Oh, it seems it's because of the scrolling. I think it's because when it scrolls, I think it makes it blurry, and when she stops, then maybe it focuses in.
Okay.
Okay,
Well,
thanks, everybody. I'm going to stop it for now
what happens when you try something new?
and go back to the presentation.
Also, I do want to let you know that it looks like you have a pop-up on the bottom right-hand corner that's blocking part of the share screen.
I don't even see the pop-up.
We just see it as grayed out on our end.
Okay, how would I control that?
You can always do a full screen slideshow instead of within the browser. 1 second. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Perfect. I think
Laura is MABE's communication and programming coordinator and our guru in everything technology. We couldn't do it without her. So thank you, Laura. Okay, so we learned who's here and we learned some of your goals today. It sounds very much like your goals are some of our goals. So the goals for our roundtable discussion are to provide you with an opportunity to hear about the current state of dual language education legislation and data in our region, to address staffing shortage in dual language education by creating alternative pathways to licensure, to support alternative assessments that validate dual language education students, to evaluate funding needs that help implement and sustain dual language education programs, to commit to establishing or expanding dual language education offerings in districts or the region, to join a network of support for implementing and sustaining dual language education programs, to spread the word of the benefits and effectiveness of dual language education for students, families, and communities. By making connections and creating opportunities for collaboration among many stakeholders, we will be able to move forward together in creating the most equitable education and language learning programs for our students, especially those in underserved groups. In today's agenda, we will listen and ask questions about the research on dual language education. We will then listen and ask questions about data and legislative stories from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Dr. Deb Palmer will be sharing an inspirational talk of how the goals of dual language education programs have the potential to transform school communities through critical consciousness. We will go into breakout rooms of diverse stakeholders by state for conversations and discussion. And finally, we're going to use idea boards, something similar to Padlet, where we each will share what is one action you will be committed to in promoting dual language education as you leave today. To assist groups in engaging in discussion, we have created a graphic organizer with prompts for discussions and space for taking notes as you listen to the 3 agenda items of dual language education research, the data and legislation stories of the 3 states, and the inspirational words on critical consciousness. The final column in the graphic organizer is a place to write down suggestions and use the ideas for the next steps generated for the discussions. At the end of the meeting, be prepared to share what is the one action you'll be committed to, promoting dual language education as you leave today, which I just mentioned. So let's take a moment to make sure everyone has access to the note-taking graphic organizer. We just put the link into the chat. It's going to require you to make a copy. So it's a two-step approach. You go to the link, it's going to ask you to make a copy of this graphic organizer. And we're doing that so that each one of you can take your own notes. You will not be required to submit your note-taking document. It's just a guide for you as we engage in our work today. Okay. So first on our agenda is a presentation on the research about the effectiveness of dual language education by Dr. Joan LaChance, a MABE board member, associate professor at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and co-director of EMA, the National Standards of Dual Language Teacher Preparation. Joan's presentation will set the stage for establishing the superiority of dual language education as a strategy to improve academic performance of language minority students and emerging bilinguals. And now I pass it on to Joan.
Thank you so much, Phyllis, and welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see you all on Zoom. This is one of my all-time favorite things to talk about when it comes to dual language education is the research that Thomas and Collier have been doing for many years, decades, as a matter of fact. The last we've stopped counting, they have analyzed over 8 million student outcomes. And I'm just going to present a few of those ideas this morning from sort of a broad perspective, and then I'm going to hone in a little bit on the North Carolina perspective and our story from the state. Okay, so if you want to go to the next slide, Phyllis. So many of you who have either purchased or read any of the Thomas and Collier books or been in any of their presentations before, we refer to this slide as the graph. This is a composite of information across 6 different program models. The data were collected in 5 different California schools. Many students, obviously, their student outcomes were included in this study. And from a statistical perspective, I just like to clarify that the acronym on the side, NCE, stands for normal curve equivalence. So for all of you who are studying statistics or have studied and like that field of analysis, this is right up your alley. For those of us who are not necessarily mixed into the world of statistics, I just want to sort of interpret what you're seeing in layman's terms. So there are 6 colors here. The dark blue at the top represents two-way dual language programs. Then there's sort of a hot pink color, which represents one-way dual immersion programs. We have a yellow line on the graph that represents late exit transitional bilingual programs. Then we have sort of a turquoise line that represents early exit transitional programs, so probably 2 years or less in a transitional program. Then we have a purple line. It's sort of a grape color, which represents content English language development. And then the final 5th line here is sort of a crimson red, and it represents ESL students who have been pulled out of the content-based classroom. So the other thing that I want to point out about the graph is on the bottom, you have the grade levels, sort of these snapshots from beginning in 1st grade, then 3rd grade, 5th, 7th, 9th, and on into high school, 11th grade. And the first thing that I see when I look at this and hear is Dr. Thomas's voice by just saying over and over again, the message he sends is, if you really want to know how an elementary school program, a high quality program is doing, look at how the students are performing in middle and high school. And this is very much representative of that. So I'll just take a moment and ask you to look at your handout and see what you can notice about this graph. If you want to jot down any notes right away, if you want to put something quickly in the chat box, just to say sort of, what do you see in terms of the difference between a two-way program versus a pull-out ESL program? Yael, did you want to interject something?
Yes, I just want to make sure that people understand what the difference is between a two-way dual immersion and a one-way dual immersion.
Absolutely. I can completely clarify that. Thank you for that. So when you have a two-way dual immersion program, the classroom is composed of approximately half of the learners are perhaps English speakers. English is their first language. And the other half, I'll use Spanish as the partner language example, since so many of our programs are Spanish English. The other half are native Spanish speakers. When the percentages begin to tip more toward 70-30, where there's 70% English speakers versus 30% of the Spanish speaking students, then we're really moving more into the zone of a one-way dual immersion program, which is primarily made up of a group of students from one language group. In this case, I'll use the example of English speakers who are learning for at least half of the day in a language other than English. We do know that in some international programs, the majority group could perhaps be, they're all Spanish speaking kids, or they're all Arabic speaking kids, right? And they're learning English there, but it's that reverse immersion where the majority of the students make up a language group, which is a language other than English. So I hope that clarifies a little bit. So does anybody want to just say in the chat box what they're noticing, the difference between two-way and one-way? Because those are really the two programs that significantly outperform all of the others. I see a question in the chat box. How would a group that was, for example, half primarily Spanish speakers and half bilingual Spanish and English speakers be classified? Ooh, that is a great question. I'm going to ask that you put that on your notes, because that is definitely a new category that we need to examine. I don't have the answer specifically right this moment, but that is a very, very important classification. We do think that it's more on that two-way side. There's a little discussion in the research field, but I'm really glad that you presented that. Okay, would you like to go to the next slide, Phyllis? Okay, so the Thomas and Collier story in North Carolina really begins with a longitudinal study that we started in the year 2007. The book that's featured here on this slide with the red cover is where all of the slides you're about to see are really featured in depth. The study incorporated 7 school districts with two-way dual language programs. 11 of those programs were Spanish English as the partner languages, and 1 was a Mandarin English program. The other 2 books that Thomas and Collier have written that feature the research are the Green Book, which focuses on administrators, and then the Purple Book, which focuses on secondary education. Okay, moving right along. So I just want to present a few of the slides, and I'm keeping a keen eye on the clock. Time seems to be passing so quickly. So our high stakes testing in North Carolina is called EOG, or end of grade tests. All of you are familiar with the nomenclature, right, that your state uses. So the first slide that you're seeing compares English learners on reading and math test outcomes. And at this time, please remember that we were still using the federal acronym of Limited English Proficient. So we're looking at students who are in a dual language program versus those who are not in a dual language program, grade by grade. And the colors, it's a little bit hard to see the labeling. What you want to really pay attention to is the height of the columns on all of these slides that are red, and looking at how the comparisons, right, of who's outperforming whom. So in this particular slide, what do we notice? What are we seeing? Grade 3, grade 5, grade 7. The red columns are outperforming the green. Okay, if you would like to go on to the next slide. So here's some more data, same groups of students, but now disaggregated by a different category in terms of high risk. So we just looked at English learners versus in a dual language program versus not in a dual language program. Now we're looking at test results that are low socioeconomic status students. So again, the red column in dual language versus the green column that is not in dual language, outperforming students. Those that are in a dual language program are outperforming those who are not. Okay, next category. Special education. This one is always a hot topic. Within these data, there are 17 different exceptional children designations. EC is what we use as our term in North Carolina for special ed. And all of them are outperforming the students who are also classified in these same 17 class designations for special education. All of them are outperforming those that are not in a dual language program. So this sort of is the myth debunker of why should we continue to advocate for special education students to participate in dual language programs. Okay, next slide. And finally, we have African American students who are also categorized as an at-risk population, minoritized population, especially when we look at ratiolinguistics. All of the African Americans participating in dual language programs in North Carolina are outperforming their monolingual peers who are not in dual language programs. So really this conglomeration or this dossier of data, when we talk about this from the state perspective, is something that we're not only just proud of, but something that we use very frequently to advocate for the development of, the expansion of, or the maintenance of dual language programs, simply because we know that from a statistical perspective, all of the students participating in dual language programs across all these different disaggregated groups are outperforming their monolingual peers. So if you could, Phyllis, just go to the next slide. One of the things that I want to sort of conclude with is this planting the seeds for further thought. So one of the things that we recommend is that you all continue to collect and analyze longitudinal data according to your program types and across grade levels. This is very important as you think about the rest of the day today and making notes with the panel and even into learning tomorrow. Think about the data that you already have access to, how you can follow dual language student scores that are separate from non-dual language learners over extended periods of time. Those are the real recommendations that we make from a research perspective. So with that, I'm only 2 minutes behind schedule, Phyllis. I do want to leave.
I'm actually very behind schedule because I completely forgot a whole section on the introduction, which I will backtrack in a minute. But to close your section, there were several questions
Yes.
that were in the chat. One was around transitional bilingual education. And yes, there are some school districts that still implement that program model. mostly at the secondary
Absolutely.
level. And there are many who are transitioning from TBE to dual language, especially at the elementary level.
Correct.
There are two questions on statistics. I'm going to ask, this is specifically to you. Is this also true for students who participate in the alternate assessment? So I'm assuming this is the assessment results.
Correct.
And then the other question, are these differences statistically significant?
That's a fantastic question, Patrick. I'm so glad that you asked that, because from a funding perspective, when Drs. Collier and Thomas came to North Carolina, there was a specific amount of time allotted for this study, and it was obviously a contract, right? Like the state is funding these data collection and analyses processes, excuse me. And Patrick, what you need to know is that after 3 years of data analysis, Dr. Thomas basically said, and I'm paraphrasing, hey, we can keep taking your money, but we have reached a point where we are at a statistical significant pattern with these data outcomes. So if you want to continue the study, you can, or if you want to just sort of conclude it here, the statistical significance has been reached and we can present the data as they are. So that was a long way of saying yes. Thank you for asking that.
Okay. All right, I think we'll save that other question for later on, because I think you'll learn about it as
Yes.
we continue today. But I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I completely forgot to tell you who we are, who MABE is and who I am. So I'm going to do that right now, just for a minute before we continue with our agenda. I want to thank all of you for attending the roundtable discussion. We are actually so pleased that so many people responded to our invitation. My name is Phyllis Hardy, and I'm the Executive Director for MABE. And for those who are new to MABE, this is the first time you're interacting with us. MABE stands for the Multi-State Association for Bilingual Education Northeast. And we currently work with state schools and districts in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and very soon we'll be starting to work in Maine. We have invited you, key stakeholders in this region, to today's roundtable discussion to join us in support of our mission to promoting research-based dual language education programs that support bilingualism and multiculturalism for educational success. We believe that bilingualism and multiculturalism are assets that provide many advantages for all students, especially for our English learners. We are noticing that others are also embracing this vision, as more are using the term multilingual learners in place of English learners. By now, you all know Zoom. I'm already seeing that you're well versed with using the chat to ask your questions. We're going to just ask you to, after your name, write the initials of the state that you work in, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Maine, because later on we're going to be dividing you into breakout rooms by state, and this will help us with that logistic. You already know to mute yourselves when you're not talking and to raise your hands. If some of you are using the chat to ask questions, and to raise your hands using the reaction buttons. And we will try to find time at the end of each of the next sets of presentations to answer some of your questions, similarly to that we did for Joan's section right now. So I'll move on to the next part of the agenda, where you will now hear the demographic and legislative stories impacting dual language education in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. The state presentations will help establish the need for dual language education programming that meets the needs of an increasingly diverse racial and language minority student population. Each presentation will address the barriers to achieving the goal of increasing high-quality dual language education programs in all 3 states. Finally, they will also offer solutions to some of the barriers and ideas how the barriers might be addressed or removed. We will pause for questions after each of the state's presentations, as I mentioned. The first to speak about Massachusetts are Susan McGilvray-Rivet, retired bilingual educator and dual language school principal, currently supporting dual language leaders and student teachers, and Fabian Torres Ardila from the Gaston Institute at UMass Boston. Sue and Fabian, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Fabian Torres Ardila, from the Associate Director of the Gaston Institute. Sue and I collected some data points that want to, with the purpose of illustrate some of the conditions in which our ELs in Massachusetts are learning. Phyllis, you'll have to move the slides. Am I right? I need to tell you. Can you go to the next one?
Mhm.
So the first data point that we want to share with you is one that illustrates the gap that exists between teachers of colors and students of color in about 34 districts in the state. These 34 districts in which the majority of the students are minorities of color. And what you can see here is that many of these students, minorities of colors, are in large urban areas. And even though in some places there is a large percentage of teachers of color, in reality, the gap between the percentage of teachers of color and the students of color is very large. In some, for example, for Lee, you had about 73 percentage points. And for the school district who has the less, Boston, is about 20 points. This matters, and this matters because what we know in Massachusetts is about 89% of all ELs in the state are students of color, either Latinos, African American, or Asian. Can you go to the next one?
Sorry.
So the other data point is about the concentration of ELs in our state. So right now we know that about 65% of all ELs in the state are located in about 20 large districts. And when I mean large, is a student that have more than 1,000 students. And on average, on these districts, 1 out of 4 students is an EL student. These students, as I say, in these districts, as I say, enrolled about 65% of all students. Most of them are located in large urban areas in Massachusetts. Can you go to the next one? But what we know now, one trend that we're beginning to notice is how ELs are beginning to move in very small, small districts with less than 1,000 students in total and ELs in total, but in which ELs make a large percentage places. And things that we notice is that these are places that we don't associate here in Massachusetts as places with a large presence of ELs, but they are, and they are being located right there. But the point that I want to make here is that out of the about 380 school districts in Massachusetts, 41 districts serve 75% of all ELs. 3 out of 4 ELs are located in one of these districts. And in fact, out of these 41 districts, 27 are what the state calls high needs districts. High needs matter. Can you go to the next one? Because high needs student districts are student, well, high needs means in Massachusetts is a district which a student is economically disadvantaged, either an ELL or from ELL or a student with disabilities. So being a high needs in a high needs school district matters. And one of the things that we noticed when looking at this data is that for Latino students, African American or Black students, you can see here from this graph that about 2 out of 3 Latino students and 2 out of 3 Black students are enrolling in districts that are considered high percentage high needs students. That is, districts in which more than 50% of the students are high needs. When you go to the next one, what that means is, for example, when you consider a district in which there is a higher percentage of high needs students, that you can see on the right of your screen, you can see how in those districts, about 60% of all students are economically disadvantaged, 24 are NEL, and about 20% are students with disabilities. And you can notice the difference between being a high percentage high needs students and a low percentage high needs students, in which the majority of students are in which high needs are students with disabilities. So when we were looking at this with Sue, the key point that I want to make here is how different the social world in which our ELs are growing and studying and learning. You see, on average, if you are learning, you are an EL, learning in a in a high percentage needs student district, one out of two students is requiring some form of government assistance. 1 out of 4 students is an EL, and 1 out of 5 students is a student with disability. Totally different from the world of a low percentage high needs students, in which the largest amount of students with high needs is students with disabilities. And with that, I leave you to Sue.
Thank you, Fabienne. So as you can see from the data that Fabienne presented, a relatively small number of districts are those that care for and educate the majority of the students of color and English learners in our state. They also tend to fall into the category of high needs more often. So these are the districts with the students who most need focused attention and support. Dual language education programs are a proven way to meet the educational needs of English learners, while at the same time enhancing the education of the other students in these districts. Not only can dual language programs enhance learning, but they can also increase the diversity of our educators. Dual language programs need teachers who are bilingual and bicultural, and many of these teachers are also teachers of color. Increasing the number of dual language programs can help meet two of the needs that we have presented. So that of meeting the educational needs of English learners and students of color, and that of increasing the number of educators of color who are also available to educate the students who most need that. However, districts need support in order to implement high quality dual language programs. They need both financial support and technical assistance. Certainly the grants that are funded by the Department of Education to help start dual language programs are helpful, but that is not enough. Districts need high quality PD, and they need curriculum that specifically addresses the needs of bilingual students and students of color. There are currently bills focused on the development of culturally responsive curriculum that are being considered by the legislature. Legislators should pass a bill, one of those bills, that would ensure that English language learners and students of color would be taught curriculum that's relevant, affirming of their language and culture, and also engaging. Students also need high quality bilingual staff, and we know this is a major barrier. The number of institutions of higher education offering bilingual teacher training absolutely needs to increase. Currently, there are only 5. Alternative pathways to licensure also need to be fostered. The Department of Ed should consider creating alternative pathways to licensure to tap the sources already existing in the ranks of our state paraprofessionals. Legislators and the Department of Education need to support our colleges and universities with additional funding, especially those public universities, which are much more affordable. In fact, Tennessee has actually already started a Grow Your Own internship program, which is targeting the increasing diversity necessary for educators in their state, and West Virginia will actually not be far behind. As you'll hear in a few moments, Connecticut has also made some progress in this area. Passing a version of the Educator Diversity Act that is currently being considered in the legislature that focuses on the districts with the most need, such as the districts that we have presented in this data, and helps create alternative and supported pathways to licensure, is a definitive and positive step that can be taken toward meeting the needs of English learners and students of color in Massachusetts. Finally, accountability for dual language programs must match the way that students are instructed. It does not currently do that. The Department of Education, as it did prior to the passage of question 2, must offer a bilingual version of the MCAS. that a valid assessment is critical to measuring student achievement for dual language programs. And we would be happy to take maybe a couple of questions because I'm afraid we might be a little bit behind in our timeline.
There are no questions in the chat that I can see specifically to your section, your presentation, other than an observation of how many districts in Martha's Vineyard are in the high category of English learners.
Yes.
And Leah's writing, we have had a steady increase over the last years of English learners, and this year a huge increase. This is Leah Palmer from Martha's Vineyard.
Yes,
Okay.
I think one of the interesting pieces of data that Fabian was emphasizing is that the districts that have large numbers of ELs, which was the first graph that he presented, are also districts that primarily show up in our first graph about the difference between the number of students of color and the educators of color that are available to teach those students. However, the second graph about the ELs really shows that there are districts that might be surprising to some of us, like those in Martha's Vineyard, that actually have high percentages of ELs. So they might not be high numbers, but in relationship to the total number of students in the district, they're at least 10% or greater of their students.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan,
Thank
and
you.
thank you, Fabian. So next is a Connecticut story, and it will be told by Violet Sims, a MABE board member and professor at the University of Connecticut, and Elizabeth Howard, also associate professor of bilingual education at the University of Connecticut, a wonderful friend of MABE, and I want to give a shout out as the primary author of the Guiding Principles of Dual Language Education, a text that we all use religiously. It's on our desktop with lots of stickies. So Violet and Liz.
Thank you, Phyllis. Good morning, everybody.
Thank you. Good morning. My colleague Liz will start with the first few slides and then I'll hop in, but hello, everyone.
Okay, good. So it's interesting. I think that you'll see a lot of commonalities among the story that was just told about Massachusetts and the story that we're going to tell right now about Connecticut. That first graph in the upper left shows the change in students over the last 5 years. It's pretty updated. It's through 2020. And you can see that the story and growth of population is among students classified as English learners. That's really where the growth in the student population is, and the non-EL population has actually declined slightly. So, that's really bringing on board the need for everyone to be more aware of how to support multilingual learners in the classroom and the potential growth in dual language programs. And then on the workforce side with the teachers, there's been a concerted effort in Connecticut to promote and increase the number of teachers of color. But despite the fact that they've hired almost 2,000 educators of color in the past 5 years, the teacher workforce is still 90% white. So we're still seeing this mismatch disparity between our student population in schools and our teaching staff, our teaching population.
Let me go to the next slide.
Yes, please.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, and I guess we've got some delay. So here's a table, and these a lot of these figures from both slides come from a great Connecticut demographic report that came out just in 2020 or 2021 with updated data. So that's an excellent resource for anyone in the state or anyone else who's interested in learning about it. But it shows the districts that have at least 500 ELs. So going by the numbers, not necessarily the percentages, although you can see many of them have very high percentages of English learners, and also many of them have large rates of change in their ELs over the past several years. And so, and as Massachusetts was saying, many of these districts are also classified as alliance districts, which are the lowest performing districts in the state. So there's a lot of overlap between needs of students and needs of districts and the percentages of English learners in the school districts. You can go ahead, Phyllis. And so then this is our take on the current legislation, the licensure, and what is needed. And Violet's been very active with the legislation, so she's going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we have some pretty good legislation or good wording to our legislation in Connecticut. We have a bilingual statute that requires bilingual education, specifically when there are 20 or more English learners in the same building who speak the same home language. And so theoretically, that's really great, and bilingual education is required. The problem is that we lose accountability to this because there's a loophole that essentially says that if a certified bilingual teacher cannot be found, the bilingual program does not have to be implemented, and people can use tutors and other forms of supporting English learners that are certainly not as comprehensive as bilingual and dual language programs. And I think as we talk casually, we have all worked in districts or found places where people do not operate in good faith of sort of what this out was supposed to offer as an option, and rather use it as a way to just avoid the programming. So that can be really problematic. That same legislation or our same statute also prioritizes dual language education and names it specifically as something that districts should explore. But the problem is this is sort of an unfunded mandate. There's no funding, centralized guidance, or support for program design or implementation at the state level. We have a seal of biliteracy. The state of Connecticut established the seal of biliteracy diploma in 2017, approved for the state. However, each district decides when, whether to offer it or not, and actually even the guidelines on how to determine it, which sometimes can lead to inequity, unintended or not. So we have the bones to good legislation, and then some cons when it comes to actual accountability and support for those tenets. So there's not as much bilingual education in general or dual language education programs as there should be. When it comes to licensure for dual language teachers, the state requires a bilingual cross endorsement for teachers of the partner language, which in Connecticut happen to all be Spanish, but we know in really diverse communities, the partner language can be many things. In Connecticut, they happen to all be Spanish. However, the teacher on the English side of the dual language program is not required to have any type of specialized cross endorsement, such as bilingual, TESOL, or dual language. And we know contextually, one, there's information there. You are working with a population of English learners and should have some background knowledge, but then it also kind of brings in some inequity in terms of obviously what's required to be a teacher when you are sort of in the minority language side. So very recently, there has been some new legislative changes that aim to address some of those barriers, such as being able to forego some language testing if you have credits at the college level of the language that you aim to teach in, and some cross endorsement options for world language teachers. I have actually benefited from this recently. If you are a world language teacher and you have TESOL certification, you can actually get a secondary bilingual endorsement now in broader areas like the humanities. And so there's a lot more flexibility there. However, more could be done to promote the pipelines for teachers with certification from other countries, some of our own paraprofessionals and tutors in our buildings who have a lot of capacity, and just people from the local community. So building those pipelines, there could really just be a lot more done. And in terms of what is needed, some of the suggestions that we have connected to what exists in terms of the legislature and what's done. consequences and accountability and support for the actual legislation. So we have this beautiful bilingual statute. A lot of places do not adhere to it. You know, what should happen? Something has to happen for it to actually be enforced. Seed grants and other funding mechanisms. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about, there is some proposed legislation for seed grants, closing that loophole for both the bilingual teacher availability and increasing the pipelines themselves, and getting creative with looking for teachers from other countries, from our own community members that possess second language skills or other languages besides English, and creating the infrastructure to support dual language implementation that really focuses on a multilingual versus monolingual infrastructure. And we have seen some programs in Connecticut sort of fall apart because they don't have that infrastructure for the continued support. And sometimes where it's called dual and still the lens is monolingual, and it's that is what's centralized in terms of the instruction. And some of the future directions for dual language education in Connecticut, as I mentioned previously, there is a proposed bill on the little bottom square here, has been raised recently, that would provide seed grants for districts wanting to explore or establish dual language programs. That has not, you know, that's in the early stages of that legislation. And as I mentioned previously, last year, there were changes to the bilingual education certification requirements that give a little bit more flexibility now. And if you look at the districts that we do have in Connecticut, you can see that we have 169 school districts in Connecticut, and the ones you see listed here are the ones with some sort of dual language, either in the process, planning, considering, and not too many that are established here. And Liz, if you want to add anything here before we wrap up.
Sure. I wanted to wrap up a couple of things. One is thanks. It looks like Denise Masari is letting us know that there's also a K4, K5 program in Stratford. Thanks for letting us know. We actually had that on the list and then we took it off. We couldn't find it on the website. So we probably just didn't find the right information. So we'll add that back in. And if there are any other dual language programs that are starting or already in existence that we don't have on the list for Connecticut, you know, definitely please let us know about that so that we can be aware of it. I also just wanted to note that the Connecticut COVID Educational Research Collaborative has just come out with a call for a needs assessment for bilingual education in Connecticut. They're looking for individuals who would like to be part of a team to carry out that research within the next 6 to 8 months. They want to have data collection happening this spring and then have the report commissioned by December. And so that will be a wonderful step forward, I think, for dual language in the state.
Any questions for Liz and Violet? All right, so we'll now hear from Rhode Island. Rhode Island story will be told by Rabia Hos, Associate Professor, TESOL Bilingual Dual Language Education and Graduate Program Director at the University of Rhode Island School of Education, and Aaron Papa, Assistant Professor of World Languages Education and Educational Stories at Rhode Island College. I want to also mention that Rabia is a MABE board member and Aaron was a MABE board member as well at one point. So Rabia and Aaron.
Thank you, Phyllis. So Erin will start with the historical context as she's been here throughout all this time. So Erin, take it away.
Oh, look, can we go back one slide?
Yeah, sorry.
So good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we have dual language programs in Rhode Island. right now, and where we know that there's planning going on. And this map that we have shows the darker colors are where we have more multilingual learners in our state, and the lighter colors districts with fewer multilingual learners. And then the stars will show where we have dual language and bilingual programs. So they are generally more concentrated where we have larger populations of multilingual learners. There are programs established in Central Falls, Pawtucket, Providence, and South Kingstown, as well as into charter schools that are both in the Pawtucket, Providence area. And then we know that Woonsocket and Westerly are planning to implement programs. I also like to note that this talks about students who are labeled as multilingual learners or English learners, but we have in all of those very dark colored districts, I would say the majority of the student population is multilingual. They just may not fall into that category. So we're also concerned with those students, and we would like to see more dual language. And in places like Providence, Central Falls, Pawtucket, really the whole district should be a dual language district to really adequately serve the student population that's there. So we're hoping to continue working with everyone to continue expanding these programs. And I think, yeah.
So similarly to Massachusetts and Connecticut, Rhode Island has also had an increase in the number of multilingual learners. And I'm actually very happy to say that Rhode Island is one of the first states to adopt the term multilingual learners, so asset-based. So there has been a lot of momentum in Rhode Island to really view multilingual learners from an asset-based view. So the current number, so we have current MLLs and then former MLLs, but the number of current MLLs in Rhode Island has increased, doubled between 2010 and 2020. And the current numbers are around like 16,000. And of these, 800 are in dual language programs as of 2021 and 2022 school year. And this falls about 4.8% of MLLs are in dual language programs. So obviously there's a large need to expand the dual language programs, and RIDE actually has a lot of initiatives going on to expand the programs with the blueprints and the strategic planning that took place in the past few years. So in addition to Spanish as being the most spoken language, we have a diversity of languages that are spoken other than Spanish. So we have Portuguese, Arabic, Chinese, French, Quiche, Khmer, and Urdu, and Wolof and Swahili. So we have a diversity of languages spoken by our multilingual learners in Rhode Island. And similar to what Erin said, not only current MLLs that need the dual language programs, we also have former MLLs who represent the largest number of MLLs in these bigger districts that have the MLLs in Rhode Island. So there's definitely a need to expand the dual language programs in many districts. So you can go on to the next.
On this slide, this is a representation of basically 10 years of advocacy that we've been doing in Rhode Island around this topic. In 2011, 2012, when I was at the University of Rhode Island, we had a grant to develop the Rhode Island Roadmap to Language Excellence, which was basically a strategic plan for language education and how we can change what we're doing to meet the needs of employers. Basically, that was sort of the driver. So we received a grant from the National Security Education Program in 2011. We had a state language summit with leaders from business, government, and education. And I'd like to just point out, at that time, we did not have anyone from RIDE at our summit. So it's been also a struggle for us to get state level support, but I feel like we're in a better position right now. But at that time, we did not have state level support, and it's been sort of an ongoing effort, but we've made some progress. And now with the multilingual learner blueprint, I think we're in a better place. But we launched that roadmap 10 years ago. And then we developed the program that Rabia now directs at URI as an additional program to certify teachers of bilingual dual language education, because at that time there was only the RIC program and it was very small. So we recognized there was need there. So that was one success. Rhode Island Board of Education approved dual language program standards in 2014. And then we saw more addition of globally competent and syllabi literacy mentions in RIDE strategic planning documents. We passed in 2016 the legislation that started the syllabi literacy in our state. And then we've been advocating for all this time for a position at the Rhode Island Department of Ed to oversee language education. So to work together with the multilingual learner specialists at RIDE to lead world language and collaborate with them on dual language education. So that's been an ongoing process. And Senator Chicone, who was here and had to go to another meeting, has introduced for a number of years the World Language and Dual Language Immersion Act, along with Grace Diaz in the House. And that bill has been passed many times in the Senate and never in the House. But last year we were successful in getting the legislature to put funding in the budget for a position at RIDE. And they're now in the process of interviewing, or hopefully interviewing soon, to hire this person who would be a world languages and multilingual learner specialist at RIDE. So we're looking forward to having that more support there so that we can work with districts, among RIDE, the state education agency, local and higher ed, to increase programs. And we will be having a multilingual education advocacy day to continue these efforts on April 26th at our State House, again, live in person, as we did 3 years ago. Current legislation that supports dual language education, it's fairly limited at the moment, but we are thinking of what we might work with legislators on for next year. But as I mentioned, the World Language and Dual Language Immersion Act hasn't been introduced this year, but it was at least helpful in getting this position approved. There is a bill from Senator Quesada that would require RIDE to develop a model policy and timeline to assist LEAs in implementing dual language immersion programs. I think that's been a need we've recognized, that we have different districts all over the state trying to start dual language education, and they don't have a lot of expertise in those districts. So this would be having RIDE coordinate better with districts to provide that expertise. We also have a bill from Representative Morales that would require the state colleges and university to award college credit for the syllabi literacy. We worked on this last year. We've made some revisions to meet the needs of the universities. So I think that should be successful this year. And while it's not directly related to dual language education, I think it's helping us to recognize the languages that our students bring from home and learn in dual language programs as a real valuable skill. And then there's Senator Cano has a bill that would add multilingual learners to our funding formula, which is a potential source of funding to expand dual language education. And I believe Senator Cano is here, so I'm thankful that she's here with us today. And I'll turn it over to Rabia.
So in terms of the licensure for dual language education teachers, URI and RIC are the two programs that actually have bilingual dual language immersion certification. And for the ESOL licensed teachers who teach in English, but there are other programs that actually provide ESOL licensure. What is needed is there has been great progress, I think, in Rhode Island in the past few years with the release of the blueprint and the strategic plan. One of the goals of the strategic plan is to expand dual language programs and have high quality bilingual programs for multilingual learners, and with a goal of biliteracy at the end. So we're hoping that more dual language education programs will be established in Rhode Island. But we also are asking that there has to be a transparent collaboration and communication across the state education agency, local education agencies, and then institutes of higher education. There's a lot of work happening in silos, but clear communication would definitely support the expansion of dual language programs. One of the foundational things that we need is a legislation that supports dual language education in Rhode Island. And funding for teachers and programs to expand and perhaps create pathways for multilingual learners to be licensed teachers or bilingual dual language teachers. We need diverse staff and teachers, and although we have lots of local expertise in various languages, we are really not able to tap into those because of the different challenges that institutes of higher education require for them to get licensed. So we need to create pathways for them to be able to teach in dual language education programs. And then with the new release of the blueprint and the strategic plan and the high quality instructional framework, we really need a roadmap or action steps and how these will be implemented in different local education agencies. Who's going to be responsible and what's going to be the mandates in terms of RIDE requiring districts to implement quality curriculum for multilingual learners. So.
Okay, thank you, Rabia and Erin. Any questions for them before we turn it over to our next speaker? Okay, so now we're going to hear from Dr. Deb Palmer, a professor of equity, bilingualism, and biliteracy in the School of Education at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Dr. Palmer is also our conference keynote speaker. She will be sharing an inspirational talk of how the goals of dual language education programs have the potential to transform school communities when you infuse critical consciousness in every aspect. I'm going to switch presentations and move to Dr. Palmer's presentation. There you go, Deb.
Thank you, Phyllis, and thanks to the MABE team for the invitation to join you today. I'm really excited to be here. The only one who's put Colorado at the end of my name, but I'm a native of New England, so it is an honor to be able to speak to all of you. Next slide. So just really quick, I want to acknowledge the land that I'm occupying here in Boulder, Colorado. In honor of MABE's 50th anniversary, I made a donation to Cultural Survival, which is the organization you can see on the bottom. I think, Phyllis, you might want to go to full screen.
Yep,
just like, yeah, there you go, you got it. Which has also been around for 50 years in Cambridge. Next slide. Setting our purpose for today. This brief talk is dedicated to all of you who are builders of bridges, with Jones Talk and with, I have a cat here, excuse me, with the three excellent reports that you just heard from each of the three Southern New England states. You have the numbers, you have the arguments, so I'm just here for inspiration. I'm going to try to plant seeds for action. Next slide, please. And I think art and poetry are especially relevant for our current times and as an entry point into our discussion of critical consciousness. So shall I read this? Yes. If we were to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. That's the promise to glade. The hill we climb, if only we dare. Art and poetry speak to the importance of the word and the world. This painting was done by Marta Samaniego Calderon, an artist in Denton, Texas. Art and poetry also reinforce an important idea that serving bilingual communities con éxito is about so much more than language. Next slide, please. This talk is based on the ideas in a 2019 article that I wrote with colleagues in Theory into Practice. So I want to acknowledge those colleagues, my collaborators, Lisa Dorner, Claudia Cervantes-Sun, and Dan Hyman. Next slide, please. I also want to acknowledge those who've been working in this area for a long time and those who are pushing our collective thinking in new directions. Next slide. So dual language, bilingual education paints a beautiful picture. The model is carefully structured to promote bilingualism, biliteracy, and excellence for all. Whether you're in kindergarten or college, your students benefit from the opportunities that bilingual education provides. It's an inspiring place to work. Next slide. For all the reasons you see there. But our dual language programs are not sheltered from nor separate from reality, as the pandemic made very clear. We live in a society in which inequity abounds. Some students are rich, others poor. Some students are white, others of color. Some students are citizens, others undocumented. All kinds of challenges face our students every day. But one of the things that makes dual language programs into spaces of hope is that they hold the possibility to bring all these dimensions into the same space. Dual language programs are attractive to everyone. They can enrich and diversify any school community, whereas in so many places, and as you just heard, schools remain quite segregated and inequalities are therefore rendered invisible. Next slide. A compensatory subtractive monolingual model of education for bilingual learners is no longer enough. We need to embrace enrichment programming that allows our students to reach their full potential. So we have work to do. As I wrote 15 years ago, if the project of dual language education is to transform our vision for bilingual ed from compensatory to enrichment and high caliber, and in so doing, develop an empowered and empathic next generation, we must do so in the context of the highly imperfect society where those future leaders are growing up. Next slide. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. Next. The three core goals of dual language bilingual ed are high academic achievement, bilingualism and biliteracy, and intercultural competence. And these are lofty and important goals and can be conduits for powerful generative learning experiences for all students. But the consistent presence of inequities at the levels of policy, of pedagogy, of classroom, and of community, even where educators have been working hard to build programs that meet these goals, have led us to believe it's necessary to propose a fourth goal, critical consciousness. In fact, I'd like to argue today that critical consciousness needs to be part of more than just one of the core goals. It needs to be part of all of the core goals. It needs to be basically the foundation, the spirit, and the mission of your dual language program. Next slide. What is critical consciousness? In this image, Marta Samaniego Calderon paints critical consciousness as an emerging, beautiful, messy, unsettling, unfinished space of change. Paulo Freire explained, to exist humanly is to name the world, to change it. Human beings are not built in silence, but in word, in action, reflection. Critical consciousness is seeing and naming injustice in the world, reflecting on our own role in that injustice, and acting to transform the world. In writing our Theory into Practice article, my colleagues and I dialogued around, go ahead, next slide, yeah, you've had it, about what actions were crucial to the development of critical consciousness, what concrete things schools could do. And we settled on these four. We'll take a look at each in turn. First, historicizing our schools, ourselves, and our communities. Go ahead and click. Yeah, that one. Next slide. Being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. Next. So this is the system of castes that ruled colonial Spain. It's the institutionalization of racism throughout Latin America, throughout the Americas, potentially now throughout the world. The races of these couples determined the status of their offspring. This system determined class privilege, access to property, freedom, rights, and respect. And it still shapes today how people view and understand skin color, race, privilege, and beauty. So we need to recognize history like this if we're going to fight anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism today. Next slide. So in considering these historical legacies of colonialism, of racism, we need to look inside ourselves. We need to interrogate our own histories, our own identities, so that we can engage in solidarity work with marginalized communities. Next. And we also need to historicize our own field. Dual language is bilingual education. It emerged from civil rights struggles. It was hard won by language minoritized communities. And there is a long history of marches, advocacy, court cases that brought us to our present moment. These histories are connected. Unless we acknowledge the history, we may be apt to forget that the major purpose of dual language is to provide cultural, and linguistically sustaining and empowering school programs for language minoritized kids and communities, our multilingual identified learners. Next slide. Critical listening means breaking the silences, breaching divides, striving to understand one another, and listening for those who've been silenced. Next. We need to break the silences that usually surround schools and classrooms to talk about race, gender, inequality, colonization, marginalization. We need to have these conversations with students from backgrounds and privilege and with students from traditionally marginalized communities. These are different conversations, but both are super important. Next slide. So what would be different if parent and community meetings in dual language schools, in schools with multilingual learners, were conducted in program languages with buddies or interpretation provided for monolingual English speakers? What if district administrators were to reach out specifically to groups of immigrant families to schedule listening sessions to hear their concerns, to ensure that their voices were included in planning, or if students interviewed elders from their own community as part of the curriculum? Next slide. Art, like I said, is a powerful space for critical consciousness. It's also specifically a space for critical listening. This is a piece, actually my son created. It's titled Memorial to Mr. Jefferson. The quotes along the edges are from the 1619 project curriculum that his 8th grade American history teacher used alongside her standard texts. My son's a math kid, so he wanted you to know that the hand on the left was deliberately drawn to be 3/5 the size of Jefferson's hand. Next. Critical listening can lead to discomfort. It likely will. In fact, if it doesn't, you're probably not doing it right. Next. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true, that even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried, that we'll forever be tied together victorious. Next, engaging with that discomfort and taking the risk to listen allows us to learn. Out of discomfort comes learning. If we, as the professional educators, arrange things to keep ourselves comfortable, then inevitably someone else is made to be uncomfortable. And if we lean into discomfort, we work toward justice. Next, discomfort, of course, is not easy. Our country has been, well, mostly white people have been reacting strongly to the discomfort that came out of the racial reckoning of summer 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement. On the left are some recent headlines that point to the challenges of engaging with discomfort. And the stylized map on the right indicates which states are working right now to ban conversations about race, class, etc. Dark blue states have already signed bills into law. Yellow are in progress. So this is a real present issue. Next. Finally, interrogating power means, next slide, looking closely at policies, practices in schools, finding and naming the ways that they land on communities and individuals inequitably, speaking up when we notice injustice, and asking questions about things that don't seem right or fair. Next. So we need to bring together all 4 of these elements to engage in humanizing dual language pedagogies and to move to action and justice in our schools. Next. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it. Only we're brave enough to be it. Next slide. Critical consciousness, taking action for justice, hope, and love. Y con eso, gracias, merci, obrigada, come un, thank you. Back to you, Phyllis.
Thank you, Deb. I'm just going to get out of this presentation and get ready for our next activity. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're ready for the roundtable discussions. Oops, let me just share the slideshow. Okay. It's time to join our colleagues in your state to engage in reflection of today's presentations and participate in small group discussions by making connections, creating opportunities for collaboration among many stakeholders. We hope to be able to move forward in creating a more equitable education and language learning programs for our students, especially for those English learners, the underserved groups. I'm going to ask Laura to break us into different groups. Each one will have one of our members from our presentation today be available for you to help facilitate conversations. And then we're going to come back about 10 minutes before the hour and ask you to write your action of what you hope you will be able to do what you hope to do to promote dual language education and idea boards and close our meeting together. So we'll have about a half an hour to have a conversation together. Not too bad of an opportunity to talk together. Any questions, concerns? Please remember to use your graphic organizer note-taking to help you in your conversations. So Laura, take us away.
Phyllis, there were some suggestions that came up from our group that aren't necessarily actions that anyone in the group could take. They were more suggestions.
Well, why don't we write even suggestions down? That's fine.
Should I add those?
Sure.
Okay.
Because this is also, you know, this board will also give us other ideas of what else we can do around advocacy. So yes. The other thing that I want to let you know is I'm glad somebody at least posted this up, that there's a little plus sign on the left-hand corner. So another thing you can do is if you don't have one specific, but you like an idea that's promoted there, that's posted up there, you click on that plus sign and you're essentially voting. Well, let me change that. You're essentially going to vote that you agree that you like that idea. And so that would help us as well. As ideas and suggestions are put down and people vote on one that they particularly care for or resonates with them, that might be helpful to us to figure out, well, maybe this is the next step of activities, of actions that we can engage in.
And I do want to clarify that this is completely anonymous.
Some people are voting for ideas that are already down, so thank you for that. And you'll see that the ones that get the most votes automatically get moved right to the very front, top left-hand corner. It's kind of a neat thing about idea boards. So we're seeing words like communicating, collaborating. This is wonderful. One on critical consciousness, way to go. Taking the work of critical consciousness to help parents and staff members advocate for dual language programs that support the needs of students. And we see information about research. Research resonated with some of you. Data resonates with some of you. I heard some really good, deep conversations in the breakout rooms that I was able to visit. Later on, we will debrief with the facilitators of your breakout sessions to get more information from what the conversations that you had. Wow, this is great. Lots of great ideas. Lots of mentioning across different stakeholders. All right. This looks like we've slowed down with the stickies. No, we're still going. Great. Being patient with people to write their stickies down, their ideas down, their actions down. So one of the most popular actions is to continue with grants. So the Massachusetts has these grants. Hopefully Connecticut will pass their legislation to have these grants. Rhode Island, sorry, Rhode Island is the one that's passing legislation to hopefully have grants. Connecticut, maybe you can follow suit as well. Since it's been successful in Massachusetts, it's a good example of what worked in one state might also work in a different state. Look, Act 2.0. It was really hard just getting 1.0 work passed, but thank you for that. All right. So we're down to the last minute. Connecting with Puerto Rico. That's, of course, my hometown. I'm happy to do that. We have actually found different ways to connect with Puerto Rico over the years. Most recently through a National Science Foundation that Maria Luisa Di Stefano found for us, where we had worked with teachers in Puerto Rico teaching science in dual language programs. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint presentation just to let you know. Here's ways of contacting us if you'd like to continue conversations with us, ideas that you've come up with and want to work with us to further advocacy around dual language education. We want to thank you very much for your attendance today, for participating, for your conversations, for engaging in great collaboration with your colleagues. And we hope that we can move dual language education a little bit further and increase all of the programming in all of our 3 states, as Maine to us as well, because now Maine is thinking of the same idea. And hopefully we'll be able to keep building and increasing these opportunities for our most needed students, our underserved students. So thank you again for your participation today. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
See you tomorrow. Tonight.
you.
Tomorrow.